the man who spoke softly in court. The morning light filtered gently through the tall glass windows of the courthouse, painting the polished wooden floor with faint reflections of gold and gray. A crowd had gathered, murmuring and whispering, waiting for the session to begin. Some came out of curiosity, others for spectacle. The headlines had already stirred up enough drama. Tech billionaire SundarPichai summoned in an antitrust hearing. Cameras had followed him all week, chasing his every move. They expected a show, something dramatic, maybe even humiliating. After all, few people believed that the quiet man from India could stand tall against a seasoned legal system designed to challenge even the strongest minds. Sundar entered the courtroom silently. No security entourage, no arrogance, just calm eyes and a small nod to the bailiff who held the door for him. His posture was humble, his clothing simple, a dark gray suit with no sign of extravagance. People whispered again. Some snickered. To them, he didn't look like the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the world. He looked like a teacher who had wandered into the wrong building. The judge himself, a stern man with a reputation for sarcasm, leaned slightly toward his microphone and smiled faintly. "Mr. Pichai," the judge said, his tone laced with casual disbelief. "I hope you brought your best lawyers today, because this courtroom isn't Silicon Valley." A ripple of laughter spread across the room. Sundar didn't flinch. He merely looked up, his expression soft, almost gentle. "Your Honor," he replied quietly, "I didn't bring lawyers. I requested to represent myself." That sentence changed the temperature in the room. Even the journalists lowered their cameras for a second, unsure if they had heard him correctly. The judge blinked, clearly amused. You plan to argue your own case?" he asked. "Do you even have legal training?" Sundar smiled faintly again, the kind of smile that didn't challenge but disarmed. "I don't," he said. "But I do have truth, and I believe truth doesn't need a degree to be spoken." The laughter that followed was louder this time, though uneasy. Somewhere in the gallery, a young law intern shook her head. "He's finished," she whispered to her colleague. "You can't face a federal judge with philosophy." But Sundar didn't seem finished. He walked to the defendant's table, placing a single folder in front of him. Inside it wasn't a stack of papers or legal jargon, just a few handwritten notes and a photograph of his old office from years ago. When he sat down, his eyes met those of a man on the other side of the courtroom, a corporate rival who had filed the case against him, accusing him of manipulation and monopoly. That man, dressed in an expensive suit, leaned back with a smirk. To him, this was entertainment. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Very well," he said. "We'll allow you to proceed. Let's begin with your opening statement." The air grew heavier. Sundar stood up, his movement unhurried, almost meditative. His voice, when he spoke, was low but carried across every corner of the room. "Your Honor," he began, "before we talk about what was done or not done, I would like to tell you who I am. Not the CEO, not the man on television, but the boy who stood outside a telephone shop in Madurai waiting 2 hours just to make one call." A silence spread. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Sundar continued, his words unpolished yet deeply human. "I grew up in a small home where my brother and I shared the same room, and our dreams shared the same space. We didn't have computers. We didn't even have a television until much later. But I learned that the value of something isn't how much it costs. It's how much it changes you. When I first saw the internet, I didn't see profit. I saw possibility, and everything I built was guided by that." His voice trembled slightly, not out of fear but emotion. "And now I stand here accused of something that goes against everything I ever believed in. Greed, control, power over others. I am not a lawyer, Your Honor. I am a student of fairness. I came here not to defend my company but to defend a principle, that progress should never be punished when its purpose was to uplift." The judge stared at him, expression unreadable. A few people in the audience looked down, uncomfortable. The rival lawyer rolled his eyes and whispered to his assistant. "He's turning this into a documentary," he said softly. But Sundar didn't stop. He walked toward the projection screen, where the evidence was displayed. "These charts," he said, pointing gently, "show data. But behind each number there is a person, a user, a student who got their first scholarship online, a mother who started her small business, a farmer who learned weather updates from a simple search bar. I don't deny mistakes were made, but mistakes are part of progress. What matters is intent, and my intent has always been service, not control." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Service?" he said, almost mocking. Mr. Pichai, people don't often associate billionaires with service. A faint chuckle ran through the courtroom again. Sundar nodded slowly, absorbing the remark. Perhaps that's true, he replied. But maybe that's because most people think service means sacrifice. I believe it means responsibility. When you are given power, you are not elevated above others. You are placed beneath them to hold them up. This time, no one laughed. The rival lawyer adjusted his tie, uneasy for the first time. Something about the way Sundar spoke, without theatrics, without defense, made the words linger longer than any argument could. As the judge leaned back, folding his hands, the bailiff approached with a small note. He handed it to Sundar, who paused, reading silently. His expression changed, barely, but enough for those watching closely to sense a shift. The judge noticed. Is there a problem, Mr. Pichai? Sundar took a deep breath. It's from my son, he said quietly. He's in the audience today. The judge seemed surprised. Your son is here? Sundar nodded. Yes, Your Honor. He asked me this morning why I didn't hire the best lawyers money could buy. I told him that sometimes it's not about winning. It's about showing what integrity looks like when no one expects it. The room went still again. There was something disarming about that confession, something that made even the most skeptical journalists lower their pens. The rival lawyer, now visibly irritated, rose from his chair. Your Honor, he said sharply, this is irrelevant sentimentality. We are here for a corporate hearing, not a moral lecture. The judge nodded slowly. Sustained. Mr. Pichai, please stay focused on the case. Sundar bowed his head slightly. Of course, Your Honor. But sometimes truth sounds like sentiment when it's inconvenient. That line drew an involuntary murmur from the crowd. The judge's eyes softened for a moment, but only for a moment. We'll take a short recess, the judge announced. 15 minutes. As the gavel came down, Sundar sat back, his expression unreadable. Across the room, his rival leaned forward, his lips curling into a smirk. Nice speech, he whispered under his breath as he passed Sundar's table. Let's see how long that calm lasts when the evidence starts talking. Sundar didn't respond. He looked down at his notes again, then at the small photograph inside the folder, the one of his old office, a place where dreams had started without expectation, where every success was built on humility, not hunger. The courtroom began to empty for recess, but Sundar remained still, his mind elsewhere. Somewhere in the hallway he could hear faint laughter, the same tone as before, mocking, dismissive. He didn't mind. He had heard that sound many times in his life, when he applied to universities he couldn't afford, when he proposed ideas that others called impossible, when he spoke of empathy in boardrooms filled with ego. And every time, he had turned that laughter into fuel. As he gazed out through the window, the clouds were moving slow and silent across the sun. He took a slow breath and whispered to himself almost like a vow. They can laugh, he said softly, but by the time this ends, they will understand. His fingers closed the folder gently, and for the first time that morning, a faint glimmer of quiet strength shone in his eyes. The recess clock ticked. 15 minutes until the next round, when Sundar would face not just evidence and accusation, but a twist that would make the entire courtroom question everything they thought they knew about him. And as the doors opened again, the judge returned with a faint smile, one that hinted he already knew something Sundar didn't. The weight of truth. When the court resumed, the air had changed. The quiet laughter that had filled the room earlier had faded into a more cautious silence. The journalists had returned to their seats, their pens ready, their eyes sharp. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next, the moment when SundarPichai's calm would finally break. The judge entered, adjusting his robe, glancing briefly at Sundar before speaking. Court is now back in session, he said. Mr. Pichai, I assume you're ready to continue your defense? Sundar stood slowly, giving a small nod. Yes, Your Honor, he said. His tone was steady, but his eyes revealed a weight, the kind of quiet strength that comes from years of fighting unseen battles. He opened his folder again, not with rush or show, but with the same gentle focus as someone opening a letter from the past. The rival lawyer, Mr. Hansen, a man known for his sharp tongue, stood as well, holding a thick stack of papers. Your Honor, he said, before Mr. Pichai continues, the prosecution would like to submit new evidence. Internal emails dated 3 years ago, showing his direct involvement in data collection practices that violated user trust. A few gasps rippled through the courtroom. Cameras clicked. Sundar's expression didn't change, but a faint muscle in his jaw tightened. The judge nodded. Proceed. Hansen smirked, holding up one of the printed emails. This one, he said, waving it lightly, contains a message from you, Mr. Pichai. You wrote, and I quote, "We must not let users opt out of personalized tracking. It will reduce our engagement metrics. Would you like to explain this statement to the court?" The silence was thick enough to feel. Sundar looked at the document, then at Hansen. "Yes," he said quietly. "I would." "By all means," Hansen replied, stepping back with a mock bow. Sundar took a slow breath. "That email," he said, "was written during a meeting discussion. It was one line from a conversation about balancing user privacy and system optimization. What this paper doesn't show," he continued, "is the second half of the sentence and the part that says, 'Until we create a model that gives users choice without breaking the service.' But of course," he added softly, "it's easier to print half the truth when the whole truth doesn't serve your purpose," the courtroom murmured. The judge looked down at the document again, frowning slightly. Hansen, caught off guard, tried to recover. "So you're saying this is out of context?" "I'm saying," Sundar replied, "that truth without context becomes manipulation. And manipulation is the very thing you're accusing me of." The room fell silent again. Hansen's smirk faded. He shuffled his papers, frustrated. "Your Honor," he said quickly, "I request the court to consider that these explanations are merely opinions. The evidence speaks for itself." But before the judge could respond, Sundar spoke again, his tone still calm but firmer now. "Your Honor, may I show something to the court?" The judge hesitated, studying him. "Go ahead." Sundar turned toward the large screen. "This," he said, tapping his tablet, "is an internal memo from the same week. It's signed by me and the ethics board. It reads, 'We will not prioritize profit over privacy even if it slows growth.'" The words appeared on the screen. The audience leaned forward. Journalists scribbled furiously. The judge looked from the screen to Sundar. "Why didn't your lawyers bring this forward?" he asked. "Because I didn't hire any," Sundar replied simply. "And maybe," he added with a faint smile, "I wanted to see how long it would take before someone cared enough to ask for the full picture." There was no laughter this time. Even Hansen's assistant looked uneasy. The energy of the courtroom had shifted once again, from mockery to curiosity, from dismissal to a growing respect that no one wanted to admit out loud. The judge leaned back. "Mr. Pichai," he said slowly, "you do realize you're under oath. These statements carry consequences." "Truth always carries consequences, Your Honor," Sundar replied softly, "but so does silence." His words lingered in the air. After a pause, Hansen cleared his throat, forcing himself back into control. "Very well," he said. "Let's move on. Mr. Pichai, are you familiar with Project Mirror, a platform developed under your direction that was later linked to several privacy breaches?" Sundar's eyes flickered, not with guilt but with memory. "Yes," he said. "I know it well." "Would you care to explain why that project was never reported to the Federal Data Protection Committee?" Hansen asked sharply. For a brief moment, Sundar didn't answer. He glanced down at his folder again, then looked back at the judge. "Because, Your Honor," he said slowly, "that project wasn't about profit. It was about security, and it was classified. It was a program designed to prevent cyber attacks on educational servers. We didn't report it because it wasn't a commercial product. It was a humanitarian one." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Do you have proof of that?" Sundar nodded. "I do." He pulled out another document, a signed letter from a global nonprofit confirming Google's collaboration to protect student data during a wave of international hacking attempts. The judge read it, his expression softening slightly. Hansen, however, was losing patience. "You're good at this, Mr. Pichai," Hansen said coldly. "You hide behind words like service and humanitarian to cover your company's greed." Sundar turned to him, and for the first time his eyes carried something sharper. "And you hide behind cynicism," he said quietly, "because you've forgotten what purpose feels like." A few gasps echoed. The judge immediately lifted a hand. "Enough," he said. "Both of you maintain decorum," but the damage was done. Hansen's arrogance had cracked and Sundar's quiet fire had finally surfaced. The rest of the session continued with cross-arguments, data reviews, and testimonies, but something invisible was shifting. The courtroom's energy now revolved around Sundar's steady presence. He didn't raise his voice, didn't try to perform, didn't even try to defend everything. Instead, he acknowledged errors, accepted responsibility where it was due, and always redirected the focus to intent. By the end of the day, as the judge called for adjournment, the tension had melted into something heavier: contemplation. Sundar stood up slowly, bowing his head respectfully before leaving the room. But just as he reached the door, the judge called out, "Mr. Pichai," the judge said, his voice thoughtful now. "You've surprised me today. But I'm curious. If you're as honest as you seem, what drives you to stand alone in a system built to crush men who try to do the right thing?" Sundar turned slightly, his expression unreadable. "Because, Your Honor," he said softly, "I come from a place where silence used to mean surrender. And I promised myself a long time ago, if I ever had a voice, I'd use it to remind others that humility isn't weakness." The judge nodded slowly, saying nothing more. Sundar walked out of the courtroom into the setting sun, where a sea of reporters waited behind metal barriers. Cameras flashed, questions were shouted, but he kept walking. As he reached his car, his assistant approached hurriedly. "Sir, there's something you should see," she said, her face pale. Sundar paused. "What is it?" She handed him a tablet. The screen showed a news alert. New witness to testify tomorrow against SundarPichai, claiming he hid evidence from the court. The image accompanying the headline made Sundar freeze. It was someone he recognized, someone he had once mentored. His heart sank, not from fear but from the ache of betrayal. He handed the tablet back silently, his eyes on the horizon as the sun disappeared behind the courthouse walls. The witness who knew too much, the next morning arrived under a sky thick with gray clouds, the kind that seemed to press down on the city with quiet weight. Rain had begun to fall, not heavy, just enough to create small ripples on the courthouse steps. Journalists gathered again, their umbrellas forming a sea of black and blue as they waited for SundarPichai to arrive. They whispered among themselves, hungry for a new headline. Yesterday had been calm and composed, but today promised drama. Inside the courtroom, the air buzzed with low tension. The rival lawyer, Hansen, sat at his desk with a grin that barely hid his excitement. His voice carried easily as he spoke to his assistant. "Today," he said, tapping his stack of papers, "we end his calm. He won't walk out smiling this time." The judge entered, the gavel struck, and all voices fell silent. Sundar stepped in moments later, unhurried as always, though his eyes looked more tired than the day before. He nodded politely toward the judge and took his place at the defendant's table. "Court is now in session," the judge announced. "The prosecution has requested a surprise witness. Mr. Hansen, you may proceed." Hansen stood, straightening his tie. "Thank you, Your Honor. The prosecution calls Dr. Raghav Menon to the stand." The name landed like a stone in still water. Sundar's head turned slightly, his calm expression flickering with faint surprise. Dr. Menon, a man he once worked with closely during his early years in California. A brilliant engineer, thoughtful and soft-spoken. Someone Sundar had once trusted like a brother. The doors opened and Dr. Menon entered, dressed formally but walking with the stiffness of someone uncomfortable. His eyes briefly met Sundar's before he looked away. After the oath, Hansen approached. "Dr. Menon," he said, "you worked with Mr. Pichai during his early years at the company, correct?" "Yes," Raghav replied, his voice low. "And you were part of the development team for several data projects?" "Yes, including the one known as Project Mirror." There was a pause. "Yes," he said finally. Hansen smiled slightly. "Good. Now, Dr. Menon, could you tell the court what you discovered about that project before you left the company?" The courtroom waited. Even the rain outside seemed to quiet down. Raghav hesitated, his eyes darting briefly toward Sundar again. Then slowly he spoke. "I discovered that part of the project's data logs were being redirected, not for user protection but for predictive modeling." A wave of murmurs spread across the audience. The journalist scribbled feverishly. Hansen's grin widened. "To clarify, you're saying Mr. Pichai authorized this redirection without informing the ethics board?" "Yes," Raghav said softly. "He signed off on it personally." The judge turned toward Sundar. "Mr. Pichai, would you like to respond?" But Sundar didn't answer immediately. He stared at Raghav for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Not angry, not defensive, but deeply wounded. Finally, he rose. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "may I ask the witness a question directly?" "You may," the judge said. Sundar took a few steps closer. "Raghav, he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that cut through the tension. Do you remember why we built that model in the first place? Raghav looked down. To prevent malicious targeting, he said. And who was leading that initiative? Sundar asked. Raghav's voice weakened. I was. Sundar nodded gently. And when we realized some of the data had been misused by third-party contractors, who was the one who brought that to my attention? Raghav's throat tightened. I did. And what did I tell you then? The silence stretched. The entire courtroom leaned in, waiting. Finally, Raghav whispered, You said, we'll shut it down. Sundar's tone remained calm, but a deep emotion ran beneath his words. And did we? Raghav's eyes filled with guilt. Yes, he said faintly. We did. The judge raised an eyebrow. So, Mr. Menon, your testimony today contradicts your own prior statement. Raghav opened his mouth to speak, but Hansen quickly intervened. Your Honor, the witness was under corporate pressure at the time. It's not unusual for individuals in large organizations to feel forced into silence. Sundar turned toward Hansen. You're right, he said softly. Sometimes people are pressured, but not always by corporations. The judge struck the gavel lightly. Order in the court. The air felt heavy again, but this time not with mockery and with discomfort. Everyone could feel that something deeper was unfolding beneath the surface. Sundar took a step back, letting his words settle. Dr. Menon, he continued quietly, I'm not angry with you. If you believe I wronged you or anyone else, I accept the responsibility to listen. But before you continue, I just ask you one thing. Look me in the eyes and tell this court if you truly believe I did this for greed. Raghav looked up. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence was absolute. Then his shoulders sagged and his voice broke. No, he whispered. No, I don't. The judge leaned forward slightly. Please speak clearly, Doctor. Raghav exhaled shakily. No, Your Honor. I don't believe he did this for greed. I was approached by someone to testify. They said if I didn't, I'd lose my government research grant. The courtroom erupted in noise. The judge struck his gavel hard. Silence. Hansen's face turned pale. This is absurd, he said quickly.
He's lying.
But Raghav continued, his words tumbling out now as if years of guilt were spilling free. I didn't want to do this. I respected him. He gave me my first break. He believed in me when no one else did, but they said they'd ruin my career. I didn't know what else to do. The judge looked furious. Dr. Menon, are you saying you were coerced into providing false testimony? Yes, he said, his voice cracking. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Hansen shouted something about procedure, about contempt, about protocol, but the sound of his words was drowned out by the storm that had begun to rage outside. Thunder rolling over the city as if echoing the truth finally spoken. Sundar walked back to his seat slowly, quietly. He didn't look triumphant. If anything, he looked sad, as if vindication wasn't victory, but loss. The judge called for recess, once again visibly unsettled. As the court emptied, Hansen remained seated, gripping his chair tightly, whispering into his phone with a look of panic. Sundar stood near the door for a moment, watching the rain slide down the windows. Raghav approached him hesitantly. I had no choice, he said softly. They told me— I know, Sundar interrupted gently. You did what you thought you had to. I forgive you. Raghav's eyes filled with tears. But they're not done. Whoever's behind this, they have more. They said if this didn't work, they'd expose something else. Something from your past. Sundar looked at him carefully. What past? Raghav hesitated. A document from your first patent application. They said it could ruin your credibility if it comes out. Sundar frowned slightly. That's not possible, he said, though his voice sounded less certain than usual. They said it shows you took credit for someone else's work. Raghav whispered. Someone who's still alive. Sundar's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with the heavy realization that this wasn't just about a courtroom anymore. It was about a war of character, of memory, of the kind of truth that could be twisted into something it wasn't. He looked out the window again, his reflection faintly blending with the rain. Then, he said quietly, the storm has only begun. The shadow behind the patent, the storm from the day before had washed the city clean, but the courthouse still carried the scent of tension, like wet paper and coffee left too long on a desk. As Sundar stepped out of his car, flashes from cameras lit the morning air. Questions were thrown his way, sharp and hungry. Mr. Pichai, Is it true that a new witness is coming forward? Did you steal credit for an invention in your early career? Are you hiding your past? He didn't answer. He simply walked toward the entrance, his pace steady, his face calm. Inside, though, he felt something heavy building. This wasn't about a legal battle anymore. It was personal. Someone was reaching deep into his history, pulling at the roots he had planted years before his name meant anything. When the judge entered and the session began, the courtroom was quieter than usual. Everyone seemed to sense the shift. Hansen stood, his confidence restored. He had spent the night preparing. Your Honor, Hansen began, today, we present new evidence, one that questions not just Mr. Pichai's actions as a CEO, but his integrity as a man of innovation. He turned to face Sundar, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. We call to the stand Dr. Evelyn Shaw. The name hit Sundar like a cold wave. Evelyn, he remembered her clearly, a researcher from his early Silicon Valley days. They had worked together on a prototype that would later evolve into one of Google's foundational systems. She had been brilliant, passionate, but left abruptly after a disagreement. No one had heard much from her since. She entered the courtroom slowly, her expression unreadable, her silver-gray hair tied neatly back. The murmurs began at once. Dr. Shaw, Hansen said, please tell the court your connection to the defendant. We worked together, she said quietly, years ago when he was still a junior engineer. I helped develop the algorithm that later became the basis for predictive search. Hansen nodded, glancing toward the judge. And what happened to that algorithm? Her voice was steady, but her eyes flickered with restrained emotion. It was filed under his name. Not mine. The courtroom gasped softly. Sundar closed his eyes for a brief second. He knew this moment was coming, yet it still pierced like a blade. Dr. Shaw, the judge asked, are you claiming that Mr. Pichai took credit for your work? I am saying, she replied carefully, that he didn't stop others when they gave him that credit. Hansen turned toward Sundar, his voice dripping with triumph. Mr. Pichai, what do you have to say to that? Sundar stood slowly, his tone calm but deeper than before. Your Honor, Dr. Shaw is correct, at least partly. The project we worked on was a collaboration. She contributed to the initial logic model, and her ideas were vital. When the company recognized the project, they listed me as the lead because I was the one who presented it to the board. I should have insisted her name be added alongside mine. I didn't. And that's a regret I've carried for years. Evelyn looked at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. So you admit it? Hansen pressed. I admit that I failed to give enough recognition, Sundar said softly, but I didn't steal her work. The final algorithm went through 20 more versions, each shaped by dozens of engineers. Still, the foundation she built deserved acknowledgement. The courtroom fell silent again. Hansen frowned. He had expected denial, not confession. Your Honor, I'd like to submit Dr. Shaw's original draft, he said quickly, holding up a document. Accepted, the judge replied. Mr. Pichai, do you dispute its authenticity? No, Sundar said simply. The judge studied him. You're not contesting any of this? No, Your Honor. The truth doesn't need to be resisted. The judge leaned back thoughtful. Evelyn looked unsettled. She had walked in ready to confront a man she believed had wronged her, not one who met her pain with honesty. After a long pause, she spoke again, her voice softer. I spent years angry, she said. I thought you had forgotten. When I was struggling, you rose higher and higher, and it felt like the world rewarded the wrong person. Sundar met her gaze. I never forgot, he said quietly. When the award came, I told myself I'd make it right someday. I even tried to reach out once, but your lab had closed. I wanted to create a scholarship in your name for women in engineering, but I thought maybe you wouldn't want it. A ripple of emotion passed through the courtroom. Hansen's face tightened in frustration. The story was slipping out of his control. Your Honor, Hansen said sharply, none of this changes the fact that Mr. Pichai built his legacy on questionable ethics. But the judge interrupted, his tone firm. Mr. Hansen, what we are seeing here isn't evidence of deceit, it's evidence of humanity. Sometimes people make moral errors, not malicious ones. Sundar bowed his head slightly. Thank you, Your Honor. But I don't seek sympathy, I just seek clarity. Because it's easy to build narratives from fragments and harder to understand the full picture. The judge nodded. Understood. We'll reconvene after a short recess. As the courtroom emptied, Evelyn approached Sundar quietly. You meant what you said? She asked. Every word, he replied. Then why didn't you say it sooner? Because sometimes, he said softly, you wait for the right moment, not for yourself but for the truth to land where it can actually heal. For a long moment she just looked at him. Then she nodded, turning to leave. Hansen, still fuming, stopped her by the door. You could have destroyed him, he hissed. Why go soft? She looked at him calmly. Because the truth is already hard enough, she said, and walked away. As Sundar gathered his papers, his assistant hurried over. Sir, there's something else, she said, lowering her voice. A file just leaked online. It's spreading fast. Sundar frowned. What file? A video, she whispered. It shows you meeting with a senator last month, discussing data privacy. They're twisting it, saying you bribed him. Sundar exhaled slowly, his shoulders straightening. So the next attack begins. Outside, thunder rumbled again, though the sky remained bright. The war for truth was no longer confined to the courtroom. It had spilled into the world beyond, the world of headlines, manipulation, and public judgment. And as Sundar stepped out of the courthouse, facing a wall of flashing lights, he realized something deeper, that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with arguments, but with endurance, the quiet kind that refuses to bend even when the storm keeps coming. The storm beyond the walls, the courthouse doors closed behind him, but the noise outside was deafening. The storm that had once been contained within 4 wooden walls was now unleashed across screens, headlines, and social feeds. SundarPichai bribery scandal? One headline shouted in bold letters while another screamed, exclusive, leaked video shows tech giant in secret political deal. Cameras flashed like lightning. Voices clashed like thunder. Sundar's name, once a symbol of calm leadership, had become a target. And yet, as he stood at the top of the courthouse steps, the only emotion in his eyes was quiet exhaustion. His assistant, Maya, hurried beside him, holding her phone tight. Sir, the video's everywhere, she said breathlessly. They've edited the footage. It looks like you're handing him something under the table. I was handing him a folder, Sundar said softly. A report on child data safety. I know that, she replied. But the clip they're using doesn't show that part. They cut the context. Sundar nodded slowly, the corner of his mouth tightening. They don't need the truth, he said. They just need a story. He walked toward the car as reporters surrounded him. Questions flew from every direction. Did you bribe a senator, Mr. Pichai? Is this your attempt to silence regulation? Are you planning to resign? He didn't answer any of them. The car door shut, muffling the chaos into a distant hum. Inside, silence filled the space like thick smoke. Maya sat beside him, scrolling through the flood of posts. They're already demanding your suspension, she whispered. The board is holding an emergency meeting tonight. Sundar looked out the window, his reflection faint in the glass. Let them meet, he said quietly. But the truth won't hide forever. The car moved through the rain-slick streets. Each turn felt heavier than the last. Each red light a reminder of how quickly power could turn into isolation. He thought back to his youth, to the narrow street in Madurai where his father taught him about integrity. When the world doubts you, his father had once said, don't shout to prove yourself. Stand so still that even the noise begins to question itself. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in that memory like an anchor. That evening, the boardroom was cold and sterile, filled with sharp suits and sharper opinions. A massive screen displayed the video in question. There it was. A brief, silent clip of Sundar sliding a thin envelope across a table to Senator Grayson. The room was tense. One of the board members, a man named Clark, leaned forward. We need to distance ourselves, he said bluntly. Public confidence is collapsing. You can't lead the company while under suspicion. Do you believe what that video shows? Sundar asked, his tone calm. It doesn't matter what I believe, Clark replied. It's about perception. People believe what they see. Sundar nodded slowly. Then we need to show them more. He turned to Maya. Prepare everything from that meeting. The original recording, the minutes, the senator's signed statement. We'll make it public. Clark frowned. That's risky. You could expose private data or political ties. The only thing worse than a lie, Sundar said, is the silence that lets it grow. As he left the room, another member called out. This could end your career. Sundar paused by the door. My career was never the point, he said softly. Truth is, the next day the press gathered again, this time outside Google's headquarters. Sundar stepped onto the podium. No teleprompter, no speech in hand, only a folder, The same one from the video. Many of you have seen this clip, he began, his voice calm but carried by conviction. It's true that I met Senator Grayson. It's true that I gave him this folder. What you haven't seen, he continued, lifting the folder slightly, is what was inside. A proposal to make internet access safer for children, to ban targeted ads for minors, and to protect digital education programs from data exploitation. He opened it for the cameras, revealing signed documents and dated stamps. This isn't a bribe, he said softly. It's a responsibility. The murmurs began immediately. Journalists shifted, whispers rippling like wind through dry grass. Sundar continued. In times like these, he said, truth doesn't shout, it stands still. And I will stand with it no matter how long it takes. Just then, a voice from the crowd shouted, Prove it's real. Before Sundar could respond, a figure pushed forward through the reporters. Senator Grayson himself. Drenched in rain, he raised his hand. It's real, he said loudly. Every word. Mr. Pichai didn't bribe me. He challenged me to do my job better. That's what this was. The crowd went silent. Cameras pivoted. Flashbulbs burst in rapid succession. Why didn't you speak up sooner? Another reporter shouted. Grayson hesitated. Because sometimes, he said, glancing at Sundar, the truth needs the right moment, and the right courage to stand beside it. The tension in the air began to shift. A few journalists lowered their microphones. The story that had burned across the internet like wildfire was now collapsing under its own weight. Sundar turned to Grayson, nodding slightly. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, Grayson replied quietly. You reminded me what leadership looks like. The press conference ended, but Sundar didn't return to his car immediately. He stood for a long time beneath the gray sky, letting the rain soak through his clothes. Maya approached, an umbrella in hand. You should get inside, she said softly. Not yet, Sundar murmured. Sometimes you need to feel the rain to remember where you came from. That night, as he sat in his office alone, the city lights reflecting off the glass walls, his phone buzzed. It was a message and an anonymous number again. You may have cleared your name today, but the case isn't over. Tomorrow the judge will receive something that even you can't explain. He read it twice, then placed the phone down slowly. Outside, thunder rolled once more, long and deep, like the warning growl of a distant storm returning. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the faint outline of the courthouse in the distance. They won't stop, he whispered. But beneath that exhaustion, a quiet spark returned. The same fire that had carried him from a small house in Madurai to the heart of the world's biggest company. Then neither will I. He reached for the folder again, opening it one more time, as if to remind himself what he was truly fighting for. Not reputation, not power, but the simple, unshakable belief that integrity could still mean something in a world built on noise. And as the night deepened, the storm gathered again, waiting for him in the courtroom the next morning, where the final truth was about to emerge. The last stand in silence. The morning broke with an eerie stillness. The streets outside the courthouse were unusually empty, as though the city itself had paused to watch what would unfold. The sky was pale, heavy with clouds that refused to move, holding their rain like a secret. Sundar arrived early, walking through the stone arches without a word. There were no reporters at first, no chaos, no noise, only the echo of his footsteps on the marble floor. Inside, he looked calm, but deep beneath that calm was something else. Not fear, not anger, but the steady resolve of a man who knew that truth often walks its longest mile alone. By the time the hearing began, the courtroom was packed again. The air was charged, waiting. The judge entered with a stern face, more serious than before. Court is now in session, he announced. Before we begin, I must inform both parties that the court has received new evidence overnight. The murmur that followed was sharp and immediate. Sundar looked up. He already knew. The message from the night before had warned him. The judge continued. A flash drive was delivered anonymously, containing a series of financial transactions between Mr. Pichai's personal accounts and a consulting firm, linked to the government contract under question. Mr. Hansen, I assume this was submitted by your team? Hansen, though pretending to act surprised, nodded with exaggerated innocence. It came to us through a whistleblower, Your Honor. We only passed it forward for the sake of transparency. The judge nodded gravely. Very well. Mr. Pichai, you are welcome to review this evidence before responding. The bailiff handed Sundar the small flash drive. He plugged it into the court's screen system, the projection filling the room. Columns of numbers appeared, transfers, timestamps, amounts. They looked damning. They looked perfect. Maya, sitting behind him, leaned forward and whispered, "These are fakes, sir. I can tell from the formatting. It's a digital overlay." Sundar nodded slightly. "I know," he whispered back. "But I won't just say it. I'll show it." He stood slowly, turning toward the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "these transactions didn't happen. But whoever made this file is skilled. They knew exactly how to make a lie look like the truth. So I ask that we run a simple verification on this file, not through the court system, not through my company's servers, through an independent analyst, right here, right now." The judge leaned back, thoughtful. "Mr. Hansen, any objection?" Hansen hesitated. "None," he said, though his voice had lost a touch of its earlier confidence. Within minutes, a forensic analyst from the court's digital team was brought in. She connected her laptop, running the scan quietly while the courtroom watched. The only sound was the faint hum of the machines. After a few long minutes, she turned toward the judge. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "these files were modified. The metadata has been tampered with. The timestamps and server signatures don't match real transaction logs. Someone forged this evidence." The silence that followed was absolute. Hansen's jaw tightened. His assistant froze. The audience began whispering, and the judge's gavel came down hard. "Order!" he shouted. "Mr. Hansen, do you have an explanation?" Hansen stammered, his confidence crumbling. "We received it from an anonymous source," he said. "We didn't," the judge interrupted, voice sharp. "And yet you submitted it without verification. This is a serious breach of legal ethics." The courtroom turned toward Sundar. He stood still, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. His eyes didn't gloat. There was no victory in them. Only quiet disappointment. He spoke softly, his tone even but heavy with meaning. "This is what happens when we let ambition blind judgment. When truth becomes a tool, not a purpose. I don't stand here to prove I'm flawless, Your Honor. I've made mistakes, I've been imperfect, but every decision I made was driven by responsibility, not greed. I never wanted to win. I wanted to do right." The judge listened carefully, his expression softening. "Mr. Pichai," he said, "you've faced accusation after accusation with composure and grace. The court has seen enough. The charges against you are dismissed. This case is closed." For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the sound of applause began quietly from the back of the courtroom. One person at first, then more, until the entire room was filled with the echo of clapping hands. Sundar didn't bask in it. He simply nodded once, turned toward the judge, and said, "Thank you, Your Honor." As he walked out, the same reporters who had once thrown questions now stood in silence. The cameras pointed, but no one shouted. The story had changed. The man who had entered the court as a defendant was now leaving as a reminder that dignity, when held long enough, outlasts every false narrative. Outside, the sky had cleared. The sun broke through the clouds, spreading light across the steps. Sundar paused there, breathing deeply. Maya joined him, holding out her phone. "The whole country's talking about it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You're trending everywhere. People are calling this the calm revolution." He smiled faintly. "If calm can start a revolution," he said quietly, "then maybe the world still has hope." They began walking toward the car, but halfway down the steps, a familiar voice called out. It was Dr. Evelyn Shaw. She stood near the entrance, her eyes warm. "You reminded me," she said softly, "why I loved science in the first place. Not for recognition, but for truth." Sundar smiled at her. "Truth always finds its way," he said. "Sometimes through storms," she replied, "and sometimes through silence," he said back. Before getting into the car, as the vehicle pulled away, the courthouse grew smaller in the distance, but the echoes of the past few days lingered. Every word, every doubt, every hard-earned moment of stillness. Later that evening, Sundar returned to his office. The world outside was calmer now, the chaos replaced by reflection. He walked to the window, looking out at the city lights stretching into the horizon. Maya entered quietly. "Sir," she said, "the judge sent a message." He said, "Thank you for reminding us that justice isn't always loud." Sundar turned, smiling faintly. "Tell him the same is true for truth." He sat at his desk, pulling a fresh page from his notebook, the same one he had carried since his early days. At the top, he wrote a single line in small, steady letters. Power fades, but purpose doesn't. Then he closed the notebook, exhaled softly, and finally allowed himself to rest. Outside, the rain began again, not as a storm this time, but as something gentler, like the world itself was starting over, one drop at a time. And for the first time in days, Sundar smiled, not because he had won, but because he had endured, and in endurance he had found his quiet victory.